In this video, I'll be making some hat, coat and shoe storage for our new entrance hall. If you're interested in the renovation side of things, I have a video all about how we turned this space into this space as a Patreon exclusive video on my Patreon page, and there's a link to that in the description box below. I'm going to be using birch plywood for this project. We used birch ply to make our kitchen worktops, and soon I'll have a video about that on my channel too. And as the lads that are doing some of the renovation work on our home have a trade account with a local timber merchant, I asked if they could buy 3 additional sheets just for me to use to take advantage of the savings. I'm going to start with the shoe storage cabinet first, and I designed it in SketchUp because I wanted to make sure that it would nicely fit a decent amount of shoes, and we also wanted an area for boots too, which would need to be taller in height. I also designed it in a way so that you could sit down on the unit to put your shoes on. I planned the size of this unit so that I could make the top part of this entirely from one sheet of 18mm birch plywood, and here's how I'm going to be making the cuts to the sheet. Detailed plans and cut lists for this build will be available for a small fee via my Etsy page or for free to my Patreon patrons. This unit would also make for a great media cabinet or TV stand. To make the long cuts to the sheet, I need to put my track saw rails together, and then I can mark up the 3 cuts that will run the length of the sheet. And I'm only cutting these to approximate size here. The final, more accurate cuts will be done later at the table saw to ensure that each of the pieces are a consistent width. I can then set up some bench dogs so that I can start making my cross cuts, and I'm going to start with the 45-degree angle miter cuts for the 4 corners. I set the base of my track saw to 45 degrees, and then I checked it with a speed square that I trust just to make sure it would be accurate, and it looked good. I can then mark up where I want to make the cuts, line up the mark with my guide rail and make all of the cuts. These smaller panels here are the side panels. The cuts for the middle sections all needed to be made at 90 degrees. I'm using the Strawbyte offcut jigs here. These are great for when you want to keep the piece that would usually be the offcut. They have a rib piece in the middle which is the exact thickness of the track saw blade, so I can use them to place the track against the pencil mark, remove them and then make the cuts, and I know that they're going to be spot on. And these jigs are available in a range of different sizes depending on the kerf of the blade that you use in your track saw. I'll leave a link to these in the description box below. These are made by Carl at the Strawbyte workshop, and if you're not already familiar with his YouTube channel, you should definitely check that out. I'll leave a link to that in the description box below. Once all the cross cuts were made, I could cut the panels to width at the table saw to get them all consistent. I'm going to be using my Festool domino machine to do the joinery on this project. First I need to set the fence to 45 degrees, and I decided to use 3 dominoes at each joint. I just lined up the edge of the fence with the edge of the workpiece on both sides and made a cut. And then I marked up a centre point to put one in the centre. I then started to mark up where the centre sections would need to be, so I'm using one of the shelves positioned up to the inside of where the miter joint starts. And then I can scribe a line where the upright will need to be, and then I position the upright and scribe the other side of it. I then set the domino fence to 90 degrees for the cuts to the shelves and the uprights. And then I set the fence to 0 degrees and I clamped the shelf panels in place to help me position the machine right where it needed to be. It was at this point in the build when my 100k subscriber plaque arrived from YouTube, so that made my day. The inside faces of all of the panels then got sanded using 120 grit, and then I added some masking tape to where the joints would be. The tape I'm using here is 25mm wide, so I needed to cut it down to 18mm to match the thickness of the plywood that I'm using. The reason for the masking tape is that it's going to prevent getting any finish onto the areas where the glue joints will be, to ensure that the wood glue can bond properly to the bare wood. The finish I'm using here is a water-based varnish. You'll find a link to the stuff that I like to use at the My Tools link in the description box below. I chose this rather than an oil-based finish because I wanted to preserve the pale colour of the birch plywood, so a water-based finish was definitely the way to go. I'm using some scraps of wood with some screws through them to balance the panels on so that I can varnish both sides without having to wait for one side to dry before I flip them over. And I brushed each panel to remove any dust or debris before applying the finish. After an hour or two, once dry, I can then denib the panels at 400 grit. I don't know how I managed to get these shots so out of focus, so sorry about that. And then I sweep away the dust and reapply the second and final coat, and this one is really going to give a nice sheen and pop the grain nicely, but in a more subtle way than an oil-based finish would. Here's how they looked while wet. Does anyone else do a little dance when applying finish with a brush, or is that just me? Oh, just me? Okay. Here's how they looked once dry, really nice, and I can now remove the masking tape because that has done its job. Next is assembly, and I'm using the normal PVA wood glue, and normally I would say that dominoes help to remove all of the stress from glue ups because they just align everything really nicely, but this particular glue up I still found quite challenging. So I got the dominoes added and then I got the side panels in place. I made sure that the edges were flush with a mallet. I could then get the center sections assembled and put in place. And then I could get the top panel on, and the main challenge here was to get all of the joints in place and make sure that all of the edges were aligned before the glue started to set up. I used a mixture of parallel clamps, F-clamps and a few sash clamps for the glue up. I had thought about trying to do this glue up in 2 stages, and that probably would have made it less stressful, but that's with the benefit of hindsight. For the longer panels I had to use 2 parallel clamps joined together in order to pull the joints tight because I didn't have any clamps that were long enough. I left that overnight, and in the morning I decided which edges I wanted to be at the front and back of the unit, and also which panel I wanted as the top, so that the most visible panels on the unit would be the ones with the best grain and least imperfections. This writing is on what will be the bottom of the unit. I could then sand the outside faces and the end grain of the ply. I know that plywood end grain isn't to everyone's taste, but this is a look I really like. I also eased over the sharp corners with some sandpaper by hand to prevent any splintering in future and also make it softer to the touch. There were a couple of voids in the end grain too, so I filled those with some wood filler and sanded them later on. The external corners of my mitre joints did not turn out perfect. You can see here there's quite a big gap, so to resolve that I'm going to burnish the edges just using a piece of dowel, and that worked really well. After a bit of hand sanding you can see it's looking good. I then applied finish to all of the outside faces using the same process as before. Once the finish was dry, I decided to move the cabinet piece out of the way so that I could start making the other bits for the project. So I loaded it onto my sack barrow because it was pretty heavy at this point, and I wheeled it into the entrance hall where I can assemble it later on. Next it was on to making a leg frame for the cabinet, and for this I'm going to be using 24mm thick ply, which probably wasn't necessary. I expect 18mm would be fine for this too, but I chose to use it mainly because I had an offcut that was a good size left over from our kitchen worktops. But the 24mm thick plywood will add a bit of extra strength to the base. Here I'm marking up the leg frame shape based on what I'd designed in SketchUp. The Strawbyte waist side jig came in useful once again here, as you can see. I made the long straighter cuts with the track saw. And then I finished the cuts with the jigsaw. I can make use of the offcuts from these leg pieces too, as I can use those to make the bracing pieces of the leg assembly. So here I'm ripping them to width at the table saw. And then I set up a stop block and cut them all to a consistent length at the miter saw. The bracing pieces are going to be used a little something like this, but more evenly spaced. I actually made my first mistake of the project here by forgetting to set up the domino to cut in the centre of the 24mm plywood. It's still set up for the 18mm plywood, but I decided to just carry on as it didn't really matter in this situation. Stay tuned for my second mistake of the project later on. It's going to be a bigger one. You can see here that I decided to cut some of the mortises vertically and some horizontally, and that's because I wanted some of the braces to add strength and rigidity to the frame, while another 3 of them would be used to secure the leg base onto the bottom of the cabinet, as you'll see later on. Once everything was assembled, I added some clamps and I later added finish in the same way as I did to the cabinet. I can also add my maker's mark to the bottom of the leg frame. Next it was on to making the hat and coat rack, and here I'm deciding how big to make it. This rack is going to be really simple, and yet later on I still managed to find a way to mess it up. See if you can guess what I do wrong. This is basically just going to be as simple as cutting it to size, sanding and finishing in the same way as before, but I decided to use some of these button fixings which I had left over from the walnut dartboard cabinet commission I did a few months back. These provide a really strong hidden fixing, and I route out the shape of them into the back of the workpiece to make sure that the rack will mount perfectly flush to the wall. I did this all by eye because I don't have a template or anything to fit these, and they don't need to be perfect anyway because no one will ever see them on the back. But as you can see, they ended up being a pretty nice fit anyway. Then it was on to fixing the hooks evenly, and I like to position one at each end first. And then I can get Google to do the maths for me to space them equally by dividing the distance between the 2 end hooks by the number of spaces there will be between each hook.
What's 174 divided by 11?
The answer is approximately 15.818182.
So can you guess what I did wrong yet? By the way, we chose these hooks because we couldn't find any metal ones we liked the style of. We looked everywhere and the ones we found were all either traditional in style or just a bit ugly, and we wanted something with more of a modern look. We also thought it'd be fun to add a nice splash of colour to a room which is otherwise black, white and grey. Next I could apply glue to the top of the leg base, and Ria helped me to flip the unit over and get it positioned onto the leg base with an equal overhang along all 4 edges. And the base got secured with 6 screws through each of the horizontal braces. Then I could flip the unit over, and this thing is a bit of a beast. It's 2 meters in length, but we wanted it to be big because the entrance hall is big, plus we have a lot of shoes. To mount the coat rack, it was important that I fit the wall fixings to line up perfectly with the fixings on the back of the coat rack, so I did a lot of very careful measuring. I started with the central one and then carefully measured the distance from the centre of that to the ones on the left and right. I also used a spirit level to get them all level with one another. And I was pretty sure that I had done this accurately enough, so when we offered it up and could not get it to mount, I was pretty confused.
I knew this was going to be hard. I feel like I'm lining it up and it's just not going in. Yeah. Okay.
I even tried a bit of brute force, but that didn't work either. So here is the moment of realisation.
Hang on. Have you done them the right way round?
They're upside down.
Oh no. Whoopsie.
I was just thinking this project's gone quite smoothly.
Oh no, Keith.
Yes, what an idiot. I'd mounted the hooks without checking that they were the right way up in conjunction with the fixings on the other side. So I had to go and flip each of the hooks over, and then we could try mounting it again.
No, I'm balancing on.
I'm proper in. There's That's actually clicked.
Okay. Done.
Yes.
This time it went a bit smoother, so we could start loading everything up. This project took about 2.5 days to complete, and I'm really happy with the end result. In future, I'm planning to make a few other bits to fill the space in this entrance hall from Birch Ply too, to complement what I've done in this project, including an entrance table type thing, probably with a drawer, but I've not yet decided exactly what that's going to look like. If I were to make this project again, I'd have probably tried to make it a little bit shorter in height, because when you sit on it to put your shoes on, it does feel a little bit high. But the reason it was so high was because I wanted to make sure that my wellies would fit in there. So I'd probably have to take maybe 20 or 30 millimeters off the height of the legs to get it to a comfortable sitting height. And I don't think that would look as good aesthetically. So anyway, it is what it is. There'll be a few more Birch Plywood projects to come in the near future, as I still have 2 full sheets plus some offcuts to work with, and it's a material we're going to be using a lot in our new home, so stay tuned for more projects. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos. You can also support the channel on Patreon if you'd like to. There's a link to that down below in the description box, where you can get early access to my videos, some exclusive content, free plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos. Thank you for watching.